I want to address remarks to my friends at NGIC and its members, who, as we have faced simultaneously a health and economic crisis, have been vigilant, ever proactive, and at the forefront of reminding us of our shared responsibilities to work together and solve global problems that need global responses. What brings us all together is our shared understanding that most of the biggest challenges we face, from climate change and pandemics to a new arms race and rising inequalities, are global in nature. They are global problems requiring global solutions. And yet at the very time that we need the world to act together, nationalism, which I define as the aggressive pursuit of national self-interest narrowly conceived at the expense of international cooperation, has become the dominant ideology of this age. This global tide of nationalism has been washing away the painstaking work of a half-century of multilateralism. I think of vaccine inequality and our failure to cooperate to deal with it, and the huge gap, therefore, between the vaccine-rich countries, 70% of whom have been vaccinated, and the vaccine-poor countries, the poorest of which have only 4% vaccination, even as the West hoards vaccines that they do not need. And I think of our civilization not as a new world order, for there is too much disorder, but defined by seemingly ever-expanding ungoverned spaces. Not just the unruly environment of failing and fragile states, what you might call a global Wild West that's the plaything of private warlords, bandits, pirates, terrorists, insurgents, arms traders, illicit drug dealers, and black marketeers. No, the ungoverned spaces that I'm thinking of that carry even more risk and even more liability that I wrote about a year ago in my book, 7 Ways to Change Our World, encompass the entire global environment, the polluted oceans, desiccated forests, and fast expanding deserts, whose problems required greater attention than they received at COP26. I think of the world's ungoverned spaces as the entire global financial system, with shadow banking and offshore financial centers that facilitate the looting of public coffers by the world's least needy. And I think of the proliferation of tax avoidance that is only marginally downgraded by the recent agreement to impose a global minimum corporation tax rate. The ungoverned spaces include our trading system. For the first time in half a century, there's no World Trade Agreement to repeat the successes of the Kennedy, Tokyo, and Uruguay rounds, and no chance of achieving the Doha round 22 years after it was launched. But most ominously, these ungoverned spaces now include not only the world's thermonuclear safety regime, but a fast developing digital arena that brings cyber warfare, making the world look more fragile day by day as China, Russia, America develop even more sophisticated nuclear, cyber, and AI weaponry, engendering new dangers of mistakes and miscalculations that could lead to nuclear accidents and disasters. So we need to address this great irony, the huge disconnect between where we are physically, more interconnected, more interdependent, more integrated than ever before as a world, and where we are geopolitically, tribal, protectionist, and disconnected. This growing mismatch between the global nature of the problems we face and our capacity to resolve them, indeed our willingness to resolve them as a global community. For the moment when they are needed most, our international institutions are being supported the least and being bypassed. Too narrow and unenlightened view of national self-interest at the expense of diminishing international cooperation has of course been on display in the hoarding of vaccines by the global north at the expense of the global south, and more generally in the medical protectionism which has characterized the withholding of vital equipment like ventilators in individual governments' responses to COVID-19. But because no one is safe anywhere until all are safe everywhere, and because it's in our interest to honor our promise to vaccinate and protect the poorest parts of the world where the disease spreads uninhibited and affects us all in the end, we need a burden sharing agreement. We need a global treaty to deal not just with early warning systems and the distribution of vaccines, but what I call a pandemic non-proliferation treaty, properly funded to prevent outbreaks of disease turning into pandemics ever again. We cannot allow a narrow interpretation of national self-interest that puts us all at risk to triumph over the need for international cooperation. You know, when the UN was formed, a burden-sharing agreement was made to cover the costs of peacekeeping. When the World Health Organization set out to eradicate smallpox in the 1960s, a burden share was agreed upon which, even if it proved inadequate, we started to eliminate smallpox. But today, there seems to be no possibility of a burden share, even when confronting a problem deemed existential like a pandemic. We need not only a burden-sharing agreement to deal with health and global public goods in that area, but we need a global agreement to deal with climate change based on countries' wealth and their culpability for historic emissions. And we need to end the refusal of national governments to sign up to ambitious outcomes, which has left our planet facing catastrophic global temperature rises to 2.4 degrees Celsius or even more above pre-industrial levels. Poorer countries are still waiting for the 100 billions a year promised to deal with mitigation and adaptation. And they've been promised, as a result of Glasgow, only a working party with the possibility of getting the money in 2022 or 2023. In truth, somewhere between 2.6 trillion and 4.6 trillion every year is needed to fund the low-income countries for the mitigation and adaptation work they need to do to respond to the climate crisis. And even a compromise averaging out the payments by promising 500 billion over 5 years is as yet an aspiration, not a decision. So we need to act on climate change by working together. And we need to act also because the failure to sign a new nuclear arms agreement is itself sufficient cause for worry. Not just as Russia and America and now China build up more sophisticated weapons, but other countries are now considering becoming nuclear weapon states. And I share the worry expressed by George Shultz before his death that as nuclear weapons proliferate, they have lost their dread. And this is one reason why President Biden has made the initiative, but it's also one of the reasons why, because of nationalism, we've seen little progress in preventing nuclear proliferation, despite his ambitious plans to ban nuclear testing and the enrichment of uranium and to agree policies for no first use of nuclear weapons and for single use. But you know, there's an even more lethal risk as cyber and AI-led weapons create enhanced capacity to strike opponents, and with it, as a result, new uncertainties. While nuclear weapons are situated generally in an international framework of security and arms control agreements developed over decades, AI and cyber weapons have no comparative framework. Indeed, the greater the digital capacity, the greater the vulnerability. For decades, deterrence has rested on the knowledge that each side knows its rival's capabilities and understands what would motivate them to detonate their weapons. But AI weapons can select their targets and can devise their own strategies without human intervention and thus make lethal decisions autonomously, multiplying the risk of accidents and disasters. Unlike the arrangements for diffusing tensions between Russia and America, where nuclear weaponry is involved, there is no hotline, no agreed fail-safe mechanisms, no early warning systems, some of which are already falling into disuse. And because of the sophistication of artificial intelligence systems, a diminished time gap between decision and action. We urgently need cooperation, starting with dialogue. We should not wait for a crisis to begin the conversations and to update the Reagan-Gorbachev doctrine that such wars cannot be won and should not be fought. And this should prevent us from entering technology-led wars. This should start with a clear agreement that no artificial intelligence weapons will ever be fired autonomously. You know, in the last 3 decades, there was progress. Sweden, South Africa, Libya, Syria, that toyed with becoming nuclear states rejected doing so. Ukraine, which possessed weapons after the Soviet Union collapsed, has like them remained non-nuclear states. So nuclear disarmament is possible. And in recent years, despite all our difficulties, we've seen not only arms agreements showing the possibility of cooperation, but we have also addressed the ozone layer by cooperation. We've dealt with debt relief in Africa by cooperation. We managed to sign a Paris Accord on climate change by cooperation. So let 2022 be a year when we recognize enduring truths, that as humans, we don't just cooperate out of need, we have a human need to cooperate, and that prosperity to be sustained has to be shared across the world. Thank you.